Yeah, and welcome to this seminar on EU and cyber defense. My name is Pernille Riker. I'm head of the Center for European Studies here at NUPI. And today's seminar is a collaboration between the Center for European Studies and our Center on Digital Technology and Cybersecurity, which is headed by my colleague Nils Nagelhus-Schia, who will be here in a minute, I think, I hope. And it is also supported by our project Norway and the EU towards 2030, which is funded by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The objective of the seminar is to learn more about the recently adopted EU cyber-related policies and their relevance for the current geopolitical context. And cyber defense and protection of the digital space is getting increasingly important, and there are many dimensions of this. The functioning of our societies, the open democracies, are increasingly dependent on technology, but these technologies are also vulnerable against foreign interference and attacks of different kinds. So this means that the protection of our open democracies is increasingly dependent on a well-functioning cyber defense. And this is why cyber defense has been on the agenda for some time, both at the national level, the European level, in both NATO and the EU. But since a well-developed cybersecurity approach needs to have many elements, both regulations, funding, coordination of different levels of governments, as well as between private and the public sector, I think that the EU should perhaps be the best placed to develop a policy that takes all this into account. EU cyber defense policy also addresses some of the long-standing questions on the bloc's cyber agenda. Its overall ambition in cyberspace, the relations between military and civilian actors, and existing capability gaps. But the question is if this is sufficient. So at this seminar, we will discuss this in further detail, and we are very fortunate to have Dr. Patryk Pawlak here, who is a recognized expert on these issues. He will provide an overview of the recently adopted EU cyber-related policies and assess their relevance in the current geopolitical context. Pawlak is currently a visiting scholar at Carnegie Europe, and he has also been a researcher at the EU ISS in Paris. And he is the lead author of the operational guidance for the EU's International Cooperation on Cyber Capacity Building, and a former co-chair of the advisory board on the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise. And until recently, Pawlak was also project director of EU Cyber Direct, an EU-funded initiative to support the bloc's engagement on cyber diplomacy and digital policies worldwide. So he is very well placed to inform us about what the EU is doing in this area. So we very much look forward to your presentation. So I will give you the floor. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. And good morning, everyone. So I should start with a few disclaimers. So the presentation today is actually, I think, the outcome of 2 years of discussions with Niels, of trying to find a suitable date to have this seminar. And I think that date could not be more appropriate. As you know, today is the 9th of May, Schuman Declaration, where and how everything has started. People in Brussels do not work today, so they celebrate the Saint Schuman's Day, as we call it, but of course that doesn't mean that the discussions about policy and the work should stop. So thank you again for the invitation and for having me here. Another maybe a disclaimer and a sort of a coming out is that I am not really a cyber defense expert. As a matter of fact, I have tried to avoid looking into cyber defense for a very long time, simply because my background and how I started working on cyber is related to cyber capacity building. So it was a very premeditated choice not to talk about defense, exactly to avoid a separate or to maintain the separation between development and the motivations and missions of the development community, which drives cyber capacity building, and defense, which the development community has always tried to avoid. Now, a few years later, and we started those conversations in 2014, we live in a completely different world where actually development and cooperation on defense are very much interlinked, which is also something that has sort of a put stop to my resistance to deal with cyber defense as such, and sort of a look at how actually cyber defense relates to those different policy areas that I work on, primarily cyber diplomacy and capacity building. Now, Niels invited me primarily to talk about the publication that we did during my time at the UISS, which was called The Language of Power, Cyber Defense in the EU, where we tried to push this metaphor of language and use of the language that High Representative Borrell has used in one of his speeches, where he said that the EU has to relearn to speak the language of power. So we thought, why not to try to give this language of power a more sort of a structured linguistic analysis, if you want, and this is how the whole publication is also structured. When we approached the topic, and that's the edited publication with a few colleagues, we had a small puzzle at the beginning, trying to figure out whether we should be actually looking at what Brussels would like us to look, which is, you know, how do we arrange cyber defense institutionally? What cyber capabilities are needed for the EU to deliver? Or whether we maybe should look at the things that actually Brussels was not looking at. What should be the EU cyber defense posture and doctrine? What are some of the bigger questions when it comes to the application of international law in cyberspace? And it doesn't mean that they don't look at it. They simply avoid those questions because they very quickly become political. And when they become political, finding answers in Brussels, as you know, is much more complicated than trying to discuss, I don't know, increase in budget, establishing a new research program, or committing to additional project or activity linked to cyber defense. So we have made this premeditated choice, and that might also lead to criticisms of the volume, but that here we are, to actually try to look at the questions that are bigger than just what Brussels is interested in. And we actually were even pushed more in that direction after the European Parliament adopted the resolution on cyber defense, which was very institutional, very bureaucratic, very sort of a programmatic, if you want. But reading it, you would actually still not know what does the EU think about cyber defense, what it is that it wants to achieve when it thinks about cyber defense as an element of its foreign and security policy rather than a field by itself. So we've shifted our attention to, as I said, a few bigger questions. How should the EU shape its cyber defense policy so that it contributes to relearning the language of power? So it's not actually about cyber defense and the language of power as such, but the contribution it really makes to bigger cyber and security and defense policy. What does it mean actually to speak the language of power in cyberspace? Does it mean to have exactly these huge capabilities that allow you to take your opponent down and respond with brute force if needed? Or actually, is there something else that we should be thinking about, like, for instance, the UK's recent cyber responsible power narrative, right, which, of course, came after this volume was published. What is or should be the role of armed forces in the case of cyber operations with significant effect at home? Again, as you said, in the EU context, there has been a very conscious effort over the past 10, 15 years to really focus on strengthening cyber resilience. Cyber defense was a sort of neglected aspect of these conversations, but simply because the discussions about defense in the EU in general have always been very contentious issues. So how do they actually fit within this puzzle of cooperation between civilian actors and military actors? What are some of the questions that actually people in Brussels should be asking, but maybe not necessarily do? And finally, what rules should govern military operations involving cyberspace? And I will talk about those different aspects throughout my presentation with a few maybe surprising findings that we have. So, as I said, because these questions often become very political, people in Brussels tend to avoid them and move towards the bureaucratic solutions, which Brussels is very famous for. But we've tried to say, again, let's try to reset the discussion a bit and ask those questions that are maybe not very comfortable for people in Brussels. And we also wanted to make a few messages, even very obvious, very clear, and we put them really upfront into the publication. And the first one is really that the prosperous digital societies cannot exist without cyber defense posture that adequately addresses the challenges driven by our reliance on technology and internet-based platforms. So here you can see my own personal evolution going from someone who has been avoiding cyber defense for many years to talking actually about the need for cyber defense posture as an element that is really important for prosperous digital societies. But that doesn't mean that, of course, that cyber defense comes without any limitations, without any rules, or without specific governance structures. And that's exactly what we try to explore in the publication. So in other words, we really have to explain when we talk about cyber defense, not simply that it matters because we need to have strong defense, but why does it matter and how is it important for the societal goals that the country or an actor like the European Union aims to achieve. And that's important in our view, and that's how we started. So in peacetime, we know that state and non-state actors use cyber operations to attack our democracies, operations of critical infrastructures, as you have mentioned. They collect intelligence, use cyber espionage to steal or trade secrets or money from most vulnerable among us. But so far, hardly any of those incidents have really reach this threshold of armed attack, which is where the military and armed forces should be normally brought, which also resulted in the fact that their role has been really limited to deterring malicious cyber activities and malicious actors rather than actually responding. Of course, Ukraine came and it changed the conversation about cyber defense. So we can talk about it as well, how actually that has impacted some of those things that we actually took for granted for a very long time. And in such cases, cyber defense capabilities are an important component of the full spectrum of tools and mechanisms as instruments that actors have. So it's diplomatic tools, economic or law enforcement that are being used. That's the peacetime. But during wartime, malicious actors deploy cyber operations for slightly different reasons. They want to erode or constrain the military advantage that their adversaries have and could potentially have while using a cyberspace. And their such operations can be both, as we know, offensive and defensive in scope. And here the evolution of the EU cyber posture has been quite significant because for a very long time, and those of you who follow the topic might have actually picked it up from the media, but Commissioner Breton made a statement about how the EU needs to develop cyber offensive capabilities, which was really picked up very quickly by the media saying, you know, this is quite a strong departure from what the EU has been saying for all those years, that we need to focus on defensive tools rather than offensive. Of course, the member states were not happy either because it's each member state's competence to decide actually how they want to shape their cyber posture and what kind of capabilities they want to develop. So he followed up with a quick clarification that, of course, it is the member state's competence and they decide on how they wish to progress. But we have seen this use of cyber tools during wartime other than, or in conflicts other than in Ukraine. We've seen it in Georgia. We have seen it in Iran. We have seen it in Ukraine since the beginning of the conflict in 2014 and not just recently. Now, the second point that we make, and again, it's something that's maybe obvious but important, is that although most states face similar challenges of the growing intensity and complexity of campaigns by adversarial state and non-state actors, the responses developed by individual governments differ and are very much rooted in the history and national context. And even if countries speak a similar language, they actually sometimes can mean different things. When they talk, for instance, about cyber deterrence, the US and the EU have slightly different understanding of what they mean when they talk about deterrence. So for instance, if we look at a few examples, Russia's cyber posture has always been dictated by this idea of Russia's sphere of influence, and the cyber warfare, or as they refer to it, information technological warfare, is an element of information confrontation that aims to ensure superiority in the information space. Now, China's doctrine is slightly different. It locates within the larger operational concept of information operations, which also includes electronic space and psychological warfare, for instance. And the 2015 China's military strategy defines a goal of winning informationalized local wars. People's Liberation Army doctrine talks about informatized wars in which information is both a domain in which war occurs, but is also central to waging military conflicts. The US, you're probably more familiar with the idea of defending forward and persistent engagement, which have, of course, raised a lot of questions as well with regards to how states should be approaching it. The UK cyber responsible power doctrine is the most recent addition, let's say, to this catalog and has been really broadly commented on, but it's a very interesting document that has been issued actually by the UK Cyber Force that talks about how they see their mission, what are the principles that guide their actions, and how they actually approach this information sphere, if you want. But there are also countries actually that take much less militaristic approach to talk to cyberspace and focus more on cyber resilience or non-engagement, which is, for instance, the case of Japan. So that brings us to the EU and some of the most recent development. And you're probably familiar with the strategic compass and the recently adopted the policy cyber defense document. The EU cyber posture outlined in the strategic compass aims primarily to make the EU, and here I quote, a more assertive and decisive security provider. That is a quite interesting wording if you think of it, especially in the EU context. To be a decisive security provider has always been really a big challenge for the EU in any area linked to foreign and security policy. So this paradox that I always find in the discussions about cyber, that people think they can fix the problems they did not manage to fix in other areas of security policy, is a bit, to some extent, even delusional if you want. And we have these conversations in many different pockets of cyber policy. But the compass acknowledges that to effectively deal with state-sponsored cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, for instance, or malicious cyber activities in general, the EU must have capabilities to respond swiftly and forcefully. And again, if you think about this word swiftly, forcefully, effective and a decisive security provider, you see that this is not the language that or the EU uses very commonly, and how that can be achieved and where we are 1 year since this document has been adopted is maybe something we also can dive into. But then the EU policy on cyber defense that was presented in November 2022 provided this first comprehensive effort by the EU to outline its strategic policy and operational goals in cyber defense. And it has been to a large extent shaped by the events in Ukraine and how cyber tools and operations have played a role in that conflict on one hand, but at the same time this growing assertiveness of big powers like China, Russia, but also in other parts of the world, India for instance, when it comes to cyber domain. So here again, it's sort of the document aims to allow the EU and its members to act with self-assurance and assertiveness in cyberspace. Again, this is a quote from the document. It's built around 4 pillars. The first one is acting together for stronger cyber defense, so really reinforcing the coordination mechanisms. Those of you who work on the EU security policy, you recognize the pattern that whenever the EU tries to fill certain gap or find the roles for itself, the coordination is one of the biggest sort of our go-to approaches, and that is exactly the case with cyber defense. It also aims to increase information exchange and cooperation between the military and civilian communities and further support military CSDP missions and operations. And that's actually an interesting aspect, because you would think that if there's one area where the EU should focus and play a more important role is exactly how it aims to ensure cybersecurity or resilience of its CSDP missions and operations. But that's the area that EU military staff has been working on, and that's something that happens, of course, behind the closed doors, but there's very little public debate about how that would look in practice, and we know very little about how EU CSDP missions and operations, for instance, take those cyber defense elements on board. The second big pillar of this document is securing the EU's defense ecosystem, so that's primarily through standardization and certification. The third one is investing in cyber defense capabilities, but here we go to this idea of ensuring modern military capabilities again, by strengthening cooperation and the use of platforms that are already available within the EU, so PESCO, European Defence Fund, Horizon Europe, or Digital Europe program. The fourth one is partnering to address common challenges, so building really on security and defense, as well as cyber dialogues with partner countries. Of course, NATO is an important partner in that conversation. But if you read through this document, it's actually quite interesting that there are exactly some of those big questions still unanswered, right? So we read, for instance, that the document calls out authoritarian regimes for not respecting rules of responsible state behavior in cyberspace that are being debated at the United Nations. But it says nowhere that the EU commits itself to those rules when it comes to cyber defense. It does mention the commitment to application of international law in cyberspace, but the reference to responsible framework of responsible state behavior in cyberspace is nowhere to be found. And I can tell you that when we pointed this out in the report, the colleagues from the External Action Service were not happy that that's something that we picked up, but maybe escaped their attention. I would not necessarily read too much to it. It does not mean that the EU suddenly is not going to subscribe or does not subscribe to the rules of responsible state behavior. The policy-making process in Brussels are such that people basically focus on what the priorities are, and certain elements simply escape the conversation. But these are the critical elements that should be in these documents, right? So again, the fact that these reflections are being undertaken and focus on those institutional / budget-related questions and institutional solutions, rather than really trying to provide this bigger narrative, is to some extent problematic. And that analysis has led us to several observations. Maybe the most important one, and here we really pushed this language conversation further, is that rules and vocabulary are the elements that set languages apart. But to survive, languages need to evolve over time and adjust to changing societal contexts, sometimes incorporating elements of other languages. While some languages hardly ever change, and others evolve rapidly, there are also those that die out due to assimilation with more dominant languages. And one of the questions we really try to address at the end with our recommendations is, how do we actually make sure that the EU's language of power in cyber defense does not die out? You might have already picked that much of this process is really driven by EU member states. As I said, whenever it comes to questions of national security and foreign policy, member states have still safeguarded competence to take the decisions. So relinquishing these parts of national sovereignty for the sake of a closer EU-level cooperation or capacity development if defense is really very often dependent on what the member states allow the EU to do and what they actually decide not to delegate to the EU level. At the same time, other areas of the EU action in the field of cyber have evolved at a much faster pace. Cyber resilience, cooperation to fight cyber crimes, or even promoting responsible state behavior in cyberspace through tools such as Cyber Diplomacy Toolbox. And because they have moved far and left the defense bit a bit behind, over time we have really seen this disconnection or the gap between the two communities growing. So what is actually happening right now with regards to the discussions about cyber posture in the EU and the EU cyber defense is trying to sort of bring those two communities together and create the parallel and bridges. And that's the process that's not going to be easy. So when we proposed the recommendations and thought about what would really make sense to do, we again thought, okay, well, you know, if we think about languages or relearning the language of power, what are some of the some of the best ways to learn a foreign language, right? So we thought, okay, well, the first one is the immersion. You go to Italy for 10 months and hope that you'll come back speaking some Italian, and it will stay with you. You may also use the right learning tools, motivation, and will, of course, play an important element. And the third one is always the practice. So then we try to think of, okay, well, how does that actually apply to cyber? So you might understand that we've been actually picking on a lot of different elements and pushing some of those things a bit too far, maybe. So when we talk about the immersion in the EU strategic culture, what we have started with is that for the EU cyber defense to be effective, it needs to become an integral part of the EU broader and security strategy and connect to its overall strategic culture. And we, as I said, did not think this is the case. We think that it's very often thought of as something apart. Frankly, also partly between the interinstitutional competition. We have a very strong commissioner responsible for industry, where the defense falls as well, very often, but we also have a high representative that wants to be very active when it comes to cyber defense. And that, of course, results in very different solutions or flavors that are given to the policy documents. The fact that this is a joint communication, for instance, when we think about the cyber defense posture, is an indication of that. So actually, whenever you see, I don't know, well, I assume you're all familiar, but you know, the joint communication is basically the institutional compromise when actually Brussels cannot decide who should take the lead or where the center of gravity really lies. That's a sort of a compromise. So when we looked at this strategic culture and how cyber defense linked to it, of course, it's undeniable that armed forces play an important role in defending European citizens against the consequences of malicious cyber operations. But how does that actually fit? And even though close cooperation in cyber defense is mentioned as an objective in several policy documents, there is some discrepancy between the policy narrative and practice as we have seen. The EU has been rather timid in clearly defining its role in cyber defense, both at the European level, but also at international. Again, Ukraine is a sort of an exception to that rule. And the problem partly lies in the fact that most member states actually do not have those national doctrines or positions on how they actually see and think about themselves as actors in cyberspace. So that conversation is really difficult, very often driven, of course, by either big countries or the countries that are much more advanced in that domain. And that, to some extent, has led in the fact that the EU's role as a security provider has been very often sort of disregarded and seen as a modest. The EU is most of the time seen as a normative or soft power or regulatory power and not necessarily an actor in cyber defense. Again, you can see, and it would be interesting to hear from you as well, to what extent do we think that the war in Ukraine has provided a useful sort of moment for the EU to reassert this more aggressive and defense-oriented policy, and to what extent actually that is still credible. Now, in looking at those questions as well, we thought that the point of departure needs to be defining the mission for the EU's cyber defense. And it needs to reflect the EU's overall security and foreign policy goals. It should be defined in clear and realistic terms that consider the needs of the EU and member states, while clearly acknowledging the institutional, legal, and political limitations of the EU's role in this domain. And here, the risk we saw is that, you know, very often Brussels likes to come up with big ideas and concepts that then at the end of the day create a lot of expectations but fall flat because exactly the institutional politics is as it is. You know, the idea of a joint cyber unit, for instance, that has been announced by President von der Leyen several years ago and has not materialized to the extent that people want, and I think is a good example that sometimes these half-baked political ideas do not necessarily correspond to institutional realities or what the member states actually really want or are willing to give up. And when you forget about this, that sometimes leads to a bit of a suboptimal outcomes. But that's an important element that we thought needs to be kept in mind. And when we think about this mission, there are four critical elements. One, that defending and securing the EU's vital interests from disruptive and destructive attacks, including CSDP missions and operations. Here we put forward this idea of European Cyber Mission Force, which of course individual member states in most of the EU member states have. And we thought that some of the limitations that maybe are present in the discussions about European Cyber Army do not necessarily apply to the cyber domain. So we thought that that's actually an interesting advantage that, that the cyber domain might have. You don't necessarily have to move the troops across from one end of the continent to another to provide assistance. You actually can do it without necessarily leaving your country. In addition, it's important the EU cyber defense concept duly defines procedures and organizations for inclusion of cyber threats and vulnerability analysis in planning of military operations. And that's again something that the EU military staff has worked on, but as I said, that's behind a closed door, so we know very little actually what is in those documents. One aspect that's often neglected that for me was the most interesting one is developing options for the EU to shape conflict environment and to control conflict escalations. And that links to this initial idea that cyber defense cannot be an objective in itself. It cannot be this hammer that you see and use all the time whenever a problem occurs. So when preparing a cyber defense mission and shaping capabilities, it's important to understand that the use of military should be the ultimate option and should be used in case where all other efforts failed. And I think that is something that is important for an actor like the European Union that actually has not been created with the idea of the strong defense cooperation in the first place. And this principle needs to be clearly embedded as a part of a defense mission to prioritize de-escalation and conflict prevention, and reflect international commitments made by the EU and member states, including as part of the UN framework of responsible state behavior. To support this goal, member states could agree or at least exchange information about processes and escalation procedures which would allow the EU to better execute leadership in cyber defense, especially in the context of the EU-led operations. And this idea of escalation and de-escalation, I think, is really central in any discussions of foreign policy and security and diplomacy in general. At which point do you actually decide that an incident is something more just than an incident and requires responses different than maybe law enforcement response, indictment, and so on. And again, that's a conversation that I don't necessarily think is very much present in Brussels. If you look at the EU cyber postures on the policy declarations, indeed conflict prevention is often mentioned as one of the objectives of the European cyber policy, but very little reflection goes into how do we actually prevent those conflicts and how can we use the instruments and tools that the EU has to exactly think about de-escalation and conflict prevention. Now, again, Ukraine is to some extent the exception to the conversations that have been taking place. It has changed a lot of European thinking about security in general, but cyber security and cyber defense only translating to some extent even into reorganization of priorities and maybe questioning some of the myths in cyber community, like for instance that coordination of assistance is impossible because everybody wants to be seen on the ground. Actually, in case of Ukraine, we have seen that it is possible for countries and actors like the EU, US, and other big donors to coordinate the assistance and providing Ukraine to avoid duplications and unnecessary create a burden for Ukraine as a partner country in this domain. So that's important. Then another element of this mission was forging partnerships with civilian organizations and private sector. I will talk about it in a second for the sake of time. And fourth one, building and maintaining international alliances and partnerships to deter malicious actors. And this links very much to the idea of trying to understand better as well the language and the terminology that partner countries are using. But at the same time, point to the fact that sometimes it is also important to invest into better understanding of what our adversaries think and do when it comes to cyberspace, and think of having those informal channels of communication with them. That's, for instance, is Track 1.5 or Track 2 mechanisms that I'm sure NUPI and many other think tanks are involved in when it comes to, for instance, discussions with China. For many years, that was also happening with Russia and still persists in some domains. The method 2, that's the adequate learning resources. Here, we thought that while this complete immersion in the language and culture is not always possible, so in other words, not everybody can take a year off to go to Italy, it's not always sufficient and possible, so we have to think about alternative tools, and this is where different methods are important. We can learn language online as well, you know, find a tutor from another end of the world using online tools. But there, of course, the motivation and our own will is an important element. And that we thought applies to cyber as well. But here, when we talk about effective tools, one aspect that really stood out is this cooperation between the military and civilian actors. Although the military relies predominantly on the same networks that its civilian counterparts and share responsibility for protection of the nation's most critical resources, the relationship between the two, even though very often signaled and brought to the fore in the conversations, is not always very well understood. The number of events in Brussels I've attended that talk about strengthening cooperation between public and private sector, I could not count. Do we have any practical and operational outcomes from those conversations? No. There is no solution for how, for instance, the External Action Service could tap into this breadth of knowledge that private sector has when it comes, for instance, to threat anticipation. There is no legal mechanism or tool that would allow them to tap into this knowledge, because that also is linked to the whole information flow and so on. And frankly, as well, if you're counting on that partnership, you have to be able to provide something as well. Now, how can the External Action Service share information that sometimes may be confidential without having the agreement of the member states, for instance, or other actors that provide for this information? These are all practical questions that very often remain unresolved. So everybody talks about this closer cooperation between the two communities, but this doesn't always happen that easily. So if we think about some concrete recommendations, and again, I think many of them are actually already happening in parallel to the conversation that we had at the time of the production of this report. The most important one, of course, is this improving interoperability between civilian and military actors and instruments. This interoperability poses slightly different challenges in cyber defense than it poses in other areas of defense. It's primarily about clearly prescribing roles and responsibilities and cooperation mechanisms where relevant that enhance synergies between law enforcement, diplomacy, and military toolboxes, for instance. One of the key challenges there is to identify the threshold for when civilian defense ends and military operations begins. If we see an attack on critical infrastructure, how are the roles between CERTs or SOCs distributed when it comes to the attack? And when does the military step in? At which point is there an objective sort of a yardstick, or is it a political decision that leads to that escalation of the conversation? Achieving better integration of civilian and military capabilities at the EU's disposals will be impossible without closer cooperation on situational awareness and threat intelligence. In concrete terms, that might mean, for instance, a closer cooperation between military certs, which is something that the EU is already working on, or between military certs and civilian certs. There again, you know, there is a lot of sensitive and legal issues to be resolved. You know, how does the state, or how will the state and defense and armed forces use the information that is provided by civilians? Can it be potentially weaponized and used against other actors? In our democratic societies, we like to think that there is a strong checks and balances mechanisms in place and oversight mechanisms that would prevent that. But does it really? You know, we don't know until it really happens and we have the oops moment. Now, this is, as I said, probably the most critical point in that conversation for me, because on one hand, we see this acceleration of efforts when it comes to strengthening the EU's cyber resilience and focusing on strengthening the EU's own structures, institutions, policies, tools, and mechanisms, which is, of course, very desirable. But at the same time, that is not necessarily paired with the thinking about how cyber defense and armed forces fit into this conversation. And that is something that is not always easy. It's not to say that every conversation about strengthening cyber resilience needs to be also about cyber defense, but we need to think about how those two ultimately come together. So if you look, for instance, at the Cyber Solidarity Act, which has been proposed only in March this year, if I'm not mistaken, March or April. There are a few proposals that are quite interesting. One is the European Cyber Shield, which is composed of security operations centers across the EU that are brought together to sort of provide this response and information sharing structures. How are they going to link to actors like military certs, for instance, and how is cooperation there going to look like? Another proposal, cyber emergency mechanism, that aims to ensure that preparedness response to cybersecurity incidents is improved. And that is for supporting preparedness actions, so basically conducting tests on crucial sectors like transportation, finance, or energy. Mutual assistance, that means basically supporting member states one by another when it comes to cyber attacks. And interestingly, creating an EU cybersecurity reserve. The EU cybersecurity reserve would consist of incident response services from private service providers, so-called trusted providers, that can be deployed at the request of a member state or the Union institutions. Now, think about privatization of cybersecurity through the EU regulation. I find that idea quite interesting. As I said, even in the context of joint cyber unit, member states were very much reluctant to agree to any sort of forms of cooperation where a team from country X is deployed to country B to provide the assistance. Nobody wants anybody else to see what's going on in their networks, even in such an integrated environment like the EU. Now, how does the private service provider, service security provider, I mean, fits into that equation? How are we going to think about responsibility, accountability of those providers and all those tools? Again, this is the proposal, but I think that's something that it's not necessarily going to be easy for member states to swallow. Now, keep in mind, this is the Commission proposal, and we know what happens with the Commission proposals. There are many memes on Twitter on how the proposal looks like when it originates from the Commission and how it ends. But the question remains, how do military actors and armed forces fit into this expanding landscape of civilian operators and different roles they have. I think we're slowly reaching the time, so let me speed up a bit and skip some of those. Okay, method 3. Find a partner to practice, right? So that's some of us, when we were kids, we had pen pals living in other countries with whom we exchanged letters to practice the language. Now you can do it simply coming or going to another country. And that's this final step. You have to put the language and skills into practice. But finding the right conversation partner is not always an easy task. And whoever has ever done the language course in a group has probably gone through this level of frustration where you have some students who are lagging behind, who are maybe a bit more complicated. Even if somebody wants to practice your native language review, the level and the speed with which they speak sometimes can be irritating, right? So that is not always a very straightforward process. So the vocabulary, speed of progress might pose some challenges. So to become fluent in the language of power in cyber defense, the EU needs to build an effective alliance and cooperation mechanism with partners globally, we argued. It needs to better understand how other international players, both friends and enemies, approach cyber defense. What are the possible implications of those approaches for regional and international stability? And most importantly, whether those approaches are compatible with the EU's own vision. So moving forward, we proposed or suggested this importance of assessing the levels of convergence and divergence with other players. Especially when it comes to exactly these critical doctrines or missions and the conversations about what cyber forces or cyber armed forces should be doing. In the transatlantic context, of course, this conversation is very often negotiated in another part of Brussels, NATO headquarters, where many member states actually still go more frequently and think about NATO as the primary guarantor of security, where the conversation about any security matter should be taking place. And I think final piece in the conversation about the convergence and divergence, including within the EU, is this reflection about how the Mutual Defense Clause, so Article 42.7, and Solidarity Clause, Article 222, fit within cyber contexts. I can tell you that this is not an easy conversation in Brussels. My time at the UISS, we were responsible for preparing a few exercises for different levels in the council, both at the Cyber Working Party, but also for the PSC ambassadors. And you really understand that cyber is not as special as we think it is. It is actually subjected to the same limitations and rules that any other security and foreign policy conversation in Brussels, which poses limitations, of course. The second recommendation was designing adequate capacity building mechanisms for strengthening cyber resilience and defense of partner countries. And again, here it's something I had to sort of, where I had to confront my own demons when it comes to cyber capacity building and defense cooperation. But at the end of the day, it is not something that doesn't make sense, especially if you think about this link between cyber resilience and cyber defense, and to what extent actually strengthening your cyber resilience can very often be also strengthening your defense in the long term. I often say, or I like to think, that strong levels of cyber resilience are actually the best way of pushing any conflict away and de-escalating, simply because your tendency to overreact to something like a DDoS attack is probably going to be much smaller than if you do not have any capacities. So designing these adequate capacity building mechanisms is important, and we have seen with the intensification of the conflict in Ukraine, how the EU's thinking about capacity building has evolved and how priorities have shifted. They shifted from thinking about engagement with Africa, to very much thinking about engagement with Eastern neighborhood and Western Balkans, which many people thought are going to be the next theaters where this bigger confrontation might be taking place. So a lot of efforts focuses on Georgia, Moldova, and so on. And finally, I think it is important to think about using cyber defense missions to reinforce the UN framework of responsible state behavior, in particular when it comes to the application of international law. Again, that's something that the EU has committed to do in its cybersecurity strategy, have a common position on international law. But I personally do not think that is going to materialize in the shape we would like anytime soon, simply because, again, member states do like to think about those decisions about war and peace that are derived from international law as something that is their exclusive competence. And even, and here's an interesting anecdote, in some of the engagements that we have had and the survey that we have done among the member states, legal advisors, some member states have replied that they do not necessarily think or agree that the EU should have a common position on international law in cyberspace because this is their exclusive competence. But we have, as I said, this political commitment to develop it at the council level. So you see that there is this disconnect as well between certain policy decisions that are being taken and what actually people working on specific files think is realistic. So to conclude, I think that ultimately, this has been for me a very interesting exercise because I had to confront a lot of my own sort of demons, if you want, but at the same time, and that's maybe the positive message from this engagement, it was this realization that actually the cyber conversations in the EU over the past 10, 15 years have really matured significantly. So the fact that they are subjected to these institutional battles in Brussels between the EAS and the Commission, between different commissioners, between the member states and the European institutions, I take it as a good sign. I take it as a sign of maturity, meaning that cyber from the policy area that frankly 5 member states cared about in 2013 when I started working on the topic has become something that actually member states are willing to fight over in the council, and the commissioners actually are willing to fight for among themselves. That shows that that's the field that's not always marginalized, and the conversation that is not only taking place between 25 member states, as I said, but among the 27. And I think that, to me, is a good sign, because that also means that the policy making around it is going to be more democratic and more accountable, hopefully, at the end of the day. So I'll stop here, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you. I'm not used to doing 40-minute talks. So, at the conference you get 5 to 7 minutes. So I apologize if this is...
No, but this was very good. Thank you so much. It was very interesting to listen to your take on it and the publication that you made at the EU ISS. I will start out with a few questions, and then I will open, before I open for the floor, because there is one interesting thing, the way you approach it, or the way that you and your team approached it at the UISS in this publication, is this language of power, and that you need kind of to shift toward that kind of language in the EU to be able to have a cyber defense. But I approach it very differently, because isn't the whole point that the EU actually has a lot of added value without this language of power, without kind of forcing cyber field into the defense thinking? Because cyber is a very different, it's of course about defense, but it's a very different kind of defense. And what we are defending is this kind of open, vulnerable societies, data, and the fact that the EU has all these regulations, starting with kind of the Data Protection Act, or what you call Digital Protection Act, and these different regulations that has an aim to protect data. Isn't all this an important part of it? And that you said also that the EU is quite good at when it comes to resilience, but not so cyber resilience, but not so good at cyber defense. And how I have been thinking of this, isn't it better to kind of strengthen the resilience part? Isn't that what we need? Because so many other actors are working in the defense field, including NATO, and EU has the added value of kind of all these different policy areas. I'm not a cyber expert, so this is my read on kind of from a comprehensive security approach. I mean, how do you call it, the integration approach that they have, the EU have to security, kind of using all the elements. And this is, cyber is very much in a field between private, public, between the kind of, you need regional cooperation, but you also need the member states. It is between the Commission's competence and the EIS. So of course you will have these institutional kind of differences, and you need more coordination. But isn't this exactly what where the EU can deliver? So when I listened to you now and also read the publication, I felt that kind of trying to drift it towards what NATO is actually doing, more than pushing the agenda where the EU has an added value. So that's my first
yes,
question.
and I will not...
And just sign up for...
Yes, I will not disagree with you. Actually, you know, as I said, that publication is the outcome of a lot of internal struggles, because I do believe, I agree with you, that cyber resilience and this sort of a civilian approach is where the EU performs best, because this is where it has tools. And actually there is one chapter in the publication that compares NATO and the EU and concludes that actually the EU is maybe better equipped than NATO to think about the whole spectrum of cyber defense, exactly looking at from the attacks below the threshold of armed conflict and above. NATO has very limited tools when it comes to the attacks below the threshold of armed conflict. It's a military alliance at the end of the day. It cannot impose sanctions. It has maybe political tools and can act for its member states, but it doesn't have at its disposal the mechanisms that the EU has, which is the reason why as well cyber is so prominent in the EU-NATO cooperation. But I do agree with you that the resilience is this aspect where the EU shines most. And I do not think, or maybe I'll have to check after this, but nowhere in the publication do we say that the powers or the competence of the armed forces need to be strengthened when it comes to cyber defense. We do not say that the cyber defense is the critical element in the conversations about cyber posture, or should be when we talk about EU cyber posture. What we rather do is ask, how does it fit exactly within the civilian role? And how can we make sure that this balance between the EU's DNA of civilian power, if you want, regulatory power, does not get sort of tempered artificially, let's say to some extent, maybe artificially, by the defense conversations. And the fact that exactly just because we have a conflict that is taking place you know, in the EU's neighborhood, suddenly the whole thinking about the EU's security posture needs to change. Yeah, we have seen that, and it has changed, and it has evolved for obvious reasons. But I would be very careful to say that exactly that the response is strengthening cyber defense, and that's why we do not. I do not think we say that anywhere in the book. And that's definitely not something I would subscribe. What is more important, and that's I think what we are trying to point at, that if you want to go in this direction, here is a set of questions you actually have to answer first. How are your armed forces going to comply with international law? Which is a chapter in the book as well. You know, if you are going to resort to offensive cyber operations, do you actually have a legal framework for that? How are you going to be held accountable when the operation, for instance, occurs and takes place as a result of a false flag operation and misattribution? Who is going to be responsible back then? In the conversations, and frankly, that's also something that is not taking place right now when, for obvious reasons, and maybe another time we'll come to have this conversation. But what is the EU's responsibility, for instance, when it provides assistance in cyber defense to countries like Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova? And what if these tools and capabilities are ever misused and used for offensive purposes by those countries, whereas we provide them for defensive purposes, right? So these are all the questions that we try to point out and say, yes, defense is an important element, but it needs to be part of the conversation about EU's security and foreign policy. It cannot be taken apart, and it needs to respond to specific needs of the EU's security and defense policy. And I would actually maybe go a bit further with this idea that you said of cyber defense and resilience being there, to protect the critical infrastructure and so on. Ultimately, I think the objective is it's not data, it's not the infrastructure, but it boils down really to citizens, their well-being, their safety, the businesses and so on. And I think that's something that we really should be thinking about again, and not necessarily sort of wrap it in this less human references like a critical infrastructure that ultimately then scare everybody, because not many people understand what actually is critical infrastructure and how we protect it.
I have one question here from Marianne, and then Lars, and please sign up if there are more.
Hey, thank you. Thank you for a very interesting talk, and I am glad you spent the time you spent, because I learned a lot. I have two questions, and they more or less follow up on Pernille's comments. So the first is on EU-NATO cooperation, and if you could elaborate a bit more on this, because I also think that they have different kind of competences and focus areas, and maybe the EU's main quality in a sense is, like you said, that the EU actually has institutional and legal competences to do a lot of things that NATO really can't do. So going too far in the kind of hardcore defense cooperation may actually create more conflict than cooperations, like with military mobility, right, where the EU is the only actor who can actually regulate bridge construction, just to make like a very concrete example, which is why NATO now also realizes that it needs to cooperate more with the EU. So if you could just discuss that a bit more, how how you see this developing. There also seems to be much more trust, of course, in the EU. And then my second question, you mentioned all these kind of institutional challenges or the competence dilemma or whatever you refer to that, and how that could be solved. You mentioned a few examples, and of course more competences to the EU and legal competences would be the obvious solution, but that's challenging for member states. Does that mean that we're developing more and more these coordination mechanisms that are popping up in other areas, like the Peace Facility Instrument or IRIS-2, HERA, etc.? Is that what we see happening in the EU now? And will that also imply more like direct contracts with the industry, like we were seeing in space, for example? Okay, thanks.
Should we take one more? Or yeah, Lars?
Hey, thanks for a great presentation. I just wanted to probe you a bit on the investment in cyber capabilities aspect of it, because maybe more so than other security areas, you can define cyber capabilities very, very broadly. So you can say, it's about competencies, and then you can say it's about developing competencies, and then the policy you actually implement might be iPad in schools. And that those kind of policies might be more interesting for member states than policies that make up and contribute to a strategic whole or a vocabulary of power, if you want to call it that. So how does the EU go about making sure that investments actually become more than the sum of its parts and does not become all about iPads at schools?
Mm-hmm.
I regret that we took that question. Okay, so let me start with Marianne's question, and maybe I'll take the second one first about the competence and duplication. So a general observation I would like to make is maybe that, you know, whatever happens in cyber will not necessarily be what will drive the EU's defense policy in general. It will be the other way around. The cyber will always be sort of trying to fit within the defense conversations. Just to give you an example, long before the war in Ukraine, there were ideas and conversations of how cyber could fit within the European Peace Facility and how European Peace Facility could be used for providing assistance in the cyber domain. And it ended up in the eternal conversations and the documents and papers and notes, nothing has materialized. And then war in Ukraine happens and everybody is looking like, okay, well, what can we use and how can we use it in order to actually respond to what we see? So, and this is where cyber actually has become one of the key elements of the assistance being provided. So I think rather than cyber sort of deciding on what is going to happen, I think very often in the EU context, it's really the events that drive the policy. It's great if you have something in the drawer that you can pull out and are prepared for the occasion and anticipate what might come. But sometimes it is not the case. Another example that we have seen was, of course, with this cyber rapid response forces that, again, were a PESCO project that was in the making and preparation for quite some time. You know, actually, PESCO projects on cyber were never really taken very seriously, frankly. You know, like people thought of them exactly as this effort at coordination. You know, we do a training facility here. Exchange information there, but nobody thought this was something that could really have this very strong hard power component, if you want. And that became the problem exactly when the war in Ukraine intensified last year, where there was one team that was ready for deployment and never make it on the ground because the war broke out and there were many legal questions that actually nobody knew how they would be answered when it comes to, for instance, even personal security of these people on the ground and who they would be working with and so on. So there's a lot of good ideas that don't necessarily materialize or become significantly used until the moment comes. And probably this is the history of the European integration project, you know, all these proposals that ended up in the drawer and that just got pulled out at the right time of a history. But in general as well, when we talk about this competence, I think what is happening more and more is this almost a duplication of the structures and mechanisms that were put in place in the civilian domain into the military domain. So, for instance, if you look at the NIS2 directive, we have some of the proposals that basically aim to support or improve the coordination between the civilian actors. We have CSERT network, right? So then what do we do in the military domain? We create the MILNet, which would be the equivalent among military certs. In case of civilian structures, we have this EU Cyclope, and please do not comment on the abbreviations, as we know the abbreviations in Brussels are not the strongest point, but basically EU Cyclope is the structure that is a network of cyber operation centers that respond operationally to when a cyber incident occurs. So then the conversation is, okay, well, how can we actually duplicate it in the military context or in the context of armed forces? And there the idea is, for instance, to strengthen this conference of cyber commanders that has already been established a few years ago, but again, like, you know, picked up very informally, and nobody really thought that this would become a super institutionalized at some point. So that duplication, I think, is something that we will really see sort of a more of. But the question will remain and remains, I think, is how do you create the connections between the two, and who creates them, and how do you actually make this different people talk together. The European Policy on Cyber Defense is supposed to produce the progress report on this year. So let's see how many of those provisions are going to be reported as progressed on. I think that this might be really the last year, you know, the next year we have European elections as well, so not many significant decisions will be taken. The question about EU-NATO cooperation, I think everybody understands the difference and tools that both EU and NATO have. The field of cyber defense is a bit so in case of, let's say, an attack on critical infrastructure that doesn't reach the level of threshold of armed conflict, I don't think anybody will think of going to NATO and expect NATO to respond. You know, the EU will be the primary sort of point of reference for the member states. But what happens in case of attack that might potentially be a bit more political and be considered to some extent as having this level of armed conflict? If you think about the attacks on Albania, for instance, you know, their EU and NATO have actually issued statements criticizing those attacks, recalling the violations of and the framework of responsible state behavior. And this is where NATO actually is looking towards the EU to use the cyber diplomacy toolbox and other mechanisms it has in place to react. But what, when it comes to cyber defense pure, you know, and let's be honest, there is no specific structure at the EU level when it comes to cyber defense. Yes, we have the EU military staff, and yes, we have different mechanisms and programs that have been put in place. But I still think that for majority of the member states, if anything serious happens, NATO would be the primary point of reference. Also because, for instance, as I've mentioned, the mutual defense clause within the EU, I mean, there is very little understanding of when countries would actually consider the clause to apply. There are specific guidelines that have been issued and adopted by the members as member states, and if the attack happens in one member state without necessarily having cross-border effect or sort of significant implications, the other member states might say, well, sorry, this simply does not reach their level, right? So we know that when it comes to mutual defense clause, it's a declaration or invocation by individual member states. So me, let's say, as Belgium, Poland, Spain, I can judge the specific incident to merit the invocation of the mutual defense clause. But not all member states may agree with that. And that, then again, even if they agree out of solidarity, the commitments that they provide are on voluntary basis. There is no obligation. They have an obligation to provide an assistance, but it's up to them to judge what kind of assistance they provide.
Then you have the solidarity clause, which
and then there is a solidarity clause, which is very often actually even neglected in these conversations, because everybody, of course, wants to think, how do we bring PSC ambassadors on board, you know? And this is where we need 42.7 rather than 222, right? And that, again, sort of misses, as you have pointed out, this important point about where the EU's real added value might be. And the Czech presidency actually tried to bring that conversation about Article 222 as well to the table, saying, you know, it's not only about 42.7. Actually, in most cases, probably it would be Article 222 that would be applicable, but we are not even talking about that. And I think because exactly of all these issues around and some of the questions that the EU sort of has not answered, for many member states on hardcore cyber defense, NATO still becomes sort of the point of reference. But there are a few questions that still need to be answered, even if you accept that the EU is the primary point of reference. And that's the interoperability of systems and policies between the EU and NATO. We don't always speak the same language. You know, yes, there are certain staff-to-staff contacts and cooperation, also between the CERT. But the mechanisms for cooperation when things happen have not necessarily been sort of fully developed, and I think that's something that that requires much more attention. And the questions in investment in cyber capability. So for me, and I hope I understood your question, right? So how do we make sure that there is some real added value rather than just you know, iPads and claiming that we're doing something? I think in that respect, the conversation about cyber capabilities is not much different than it is from any other conversation about defense capabilities in the EU more broadly. So this idea of pooling and sharing and sort of identifying the mechanisms that fit the needs of member state is very problematic. And it's problematic because there are always member states' interests involved as well, right? So there is a big industry behind as well that sort of steers the conversation, you know, cyber defense and the decisions that are taken and to what extent politics and economics is present in those discussions is not much different for cyber than in any other policy areas. I think where there is some sort of general agreement, and this again is really the low-hanging fruit, is the trainings, as you said, but that's, you know, sort of almost obvious. And pulling resources through different information sharing platforms, trainings. I mean, European Security and Defense College is investing a lot in providing exactly this sort of a curricula for the member states. But there's very little that actually could be probably created at the EU level. Maybe the cyber ranges is something that that could be an interesting solution, because so far there is a huge reliance on individual member states exactly when it even comes to the training on those issues. So that's something that could be an interesting concrete solution. But again, there I think given the current reluctance there is towards any sort of within the EU assistance when it comes, I'm wondering to what extent, even if you provided state-of-the-art tools, member states would be making use of them. If you look at the civilian protection mechanism, for instance, you know, you can have fires in Greece and Spain, and still the governments decide not to use the civilian protection mechanism, because that means admitting to your own incapability to deal with the crisis and has political implications, right? So here, cyber is not much different. I'm wondering if you had, even if you had those 30 cyber response teams that are ready to be deployed and assist a country in conflict, or the civilian private security providers, would you use them? And I think most states would actually say no, because that, again, is this political admission of not being able to deal with the problem. But it looks great on the paper, because you as the EU actually show that you're generating this capability to assist your member states, and maybe some of them will use it. And again, as I said, you know, a lot of these proposals end up in the drawers for a long time, but when problem happens, actually, it's great to have this ready-made solution in a drawer that you can pull out.
The civilian protection mechanism, since you mentioned that I mean, that was actually quite useful during COVID. Mm-hmm. It was used, and it has also been used now in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. So, and it also has a cyber dimension, as far as yeah. So, isn't that a mechanism that could really? Don't you think that member state would actually? And now it has been used in crisis. That they will actually use the EU in that sense, because it has already now proven to be rather effective. It's not only for kind of firefighters and this kind of, it's also for the bigger crisis.
I mean, maybe, maybe because I don't.
And it has
think-
been upgraded as well
Yeah,
to the
I don't-
Risk EU.
I don't think there is a blanket sort of a yes, they will use it or no, they will not use it because I would say they would be stupid not to use it because you have a mechanism that is available and you have other members who have the resources that you don't necessarily have. But we have seen in the past that this is how they not necessarily work. 42.7 has been used only once, right? By the EU member states, and that's the only point of reference, for instance, that they have on what that would mean in practice.
Yeah.
But then when we start exercising and thinking about how does 42.7 apply in cyber, well, that's not necessarily entirely clear. Do people have to die, and how many people have to die for 42.7 to be
But to
activated?
activate this kind of crisis protection mechanism, you don't need to
No,
go-
you don't have to. You just have to, yes.
Yeah, so that is already kind of a mechanism that is there, and which also Norway is part of. So third countries can also kind of activate this.
Yes,
part of
I'm
it.
trying to think whether there has been an instance when individual member states have sort of tried to pull European actors together in case of cyber incident, you know, to deal with it. And we have not really seen it, you know, even with WannaCry, NotPetya, those big attacks, this has not happened. And it usually happens afterwards when you have when you resort to the tools like Cyber Diplomacy Toolbox, for instance, you know, and you go in the directions like we would like to impose sanctions or we would like to issue statement. But it's not necessarily in the operation context. And I agree with you that this is probably something that would make sense. I would probably think that people in the Council Working Party working on cyber issues would also agree that it would make sense. And the person who proposes those solutions think, actually, this might make sense. But then does it make sense to the member states who have to use it? And that's a completely different story. And you know, the national policymakers like to point fingers at Brussels when things don't work out, but they don't necessarily like to acknowledge when the help and support comes and it's delivered. And I think that is something that maybe still needs to be worked on. But that's very much linked again to the fact that security still remains as national competence, and it's much easier sometimes to take the decisions when it comes to providing the assistance outside and to partners rather than sort of trying to figure out and solve the problems within your own group.
I think it all depends on how you define cyber. If you define it more, it's kind of in the narrow defense way, or if it's more kind of a broader resilience question, because then it's not that challenging, maybe.
Yeah, and you know, there is for instance, if we're going in this direction, you know, and this would be an interesting litmus test for what you're saying. So the NIS2 directive foresees that the countries undertake national sort of a cyber risk management assessment. I don't remember exactly what the wording in the document is, but the idea is basically that you assess the risks at the national level and then come up with the response plan. And for the first time, the NIS2 foresees the possibility of assisting individual member states in fixing or closing the gaps in their capabilities when it comes to deal with specific risks or conducting those assessments. And there's a peer review for those assessments, if I'm not mistaken, as well. Now, let's see if member states are going to use it, right? Because so far, the EU's capacity building has been very much externally focused. ENISA has been providing sort of more the coordination role, let's say, so far when it comes to cybersecurity, but not necessarily this operational assistance when it comes to strengthening own capabilities. And that will be an interesting thing to see whether actually member states will be willing and open to do that. And to use it.
Nils, you have a question as well. Oh yeah, Elsa is coming.
Thanks. Thank you, Patrick, for a very interesting presentation. Really think it's very interesting to listen to you and to the discussion as well. And especially about the coordination part on the EU member states on cyber resilience and response. It's difficult to imagine a cyber attack that would trigger either NATO or EU. But I think that I had two questions. One is about the impact of the war in Ukraine on the EU, and the other one is about the AI regulation in the EU. So I was thinking, how much has the war in Ukraine facilitated thinking and collaboration between the EU member states on this? And in connection to what you just talked about, the Viasat attack last year, it was the first time that all the member states of the EU responded by attributing that attack collectively. So I don't know if this is something is happening here and something is moving, but it would be very interesting to hear your thoughts on this. And also, what do you think are the most important aspects of the digital battlefield in Ukraine for the policy development in the EU? So that was the Ukraine question.
with sub-questions.
And we don't have much time left.
You have 1 minute.
But if you also have any thoughts on thinking about the AI regulation in the EU, it would be very interesting because the EU just published the Artificial Intelligence Act. And I'm thinking, and a lot of people thinking about this too, also, about how this AI technology will impact cybersecurity and cyber resilience. So those things are connected, and it would be very interesting if it's a little bit, it's another topic than, but it's connected. And if you have any thoughts, it would be very interesting to listen to that. Thank you.
Okay, we just have a few minutes, but
Yes.
we will also continue over lunch, so you can
Sure.
take the short answer now and then continue.
Yes, so a very short answer that I'm happy to develop over lunch is that unlike many people who move from cyber to AI and new technologies, I try to solve the cyber problems first. There are still many questions. So I have not looked at the AI Act, and I don't want to pretend I'm an expert on this. So I'm happy to share my thoughts over lunch. It's true that this link is increasing, and if you read through a lot of EU policy documents, the references to this new and disruptive technologies like AI and so on are very often made. But I think we are in a very early stages of the conversation there yet. So, and I have not really looked deeply enough into that to give you a sort of semi-intelligent answer. But let's look at the Ukraine, and that's a topic maybe I can answer slightly better. It's true, and as I said, Ukraine has been a bit of a wake-up call for the EU, and the EU is thinking about cyber in general. Wake-up call in the sense of accelerating some of the efforts and thinking about the tools that need to be pulled out maybe of a drawer and implemented. But frankly, again, this was also, there's a lot of interesting lessons from that conversation. If you look at senior management, across the EU that frantically tried to find the answers of what can we do on cyber with Ukraine, and then sort of a different laundry list popping up from different departments and institutions in Brussels. That's on one hand good, but also a bit sad that you need to have this sort of a wake-up call in order to get your act together, and we talk so much about foresight in Brussels, for instance, why can't we be prepared and have those things ready when they come and sort of anticipate those things. When it comes to the attribution itself and Viasat attack, it's true that this has been the one that where the action has been really quite swift, and there has been a general progression in how member states and Brussels have approached attribution over the years. I think what we see right now, and exactly as you say, there's this collective attributions, but also frankly, the depth of the statements and the references to different norms and international law have really increased over years. I remember the first ones that were issued around 2017. You know, these were just the general statements criticizing the attacks and sort of restating the importance of the framework of responsible state behavior. We have seen progressively going those deeper and deeper in the direction of attributing or even indirectly pointing fingers or calling countries like China, for instance, to respect the norms of responsible state behavior. Now, this does not mean that the problem of attribution has been solved in Brussels. I think far from that. As I said, sometimes it's much easier for member states around the table to take the decisions when they concern partner countries like Albania, when, for instance, taking action when it comes to the attacks on their own. And for instance, if you look at Belgium's statement from, was it last year or 2 years ago, when they were a victim of an attack, they also proceeded with individual statement and then other member states associating themselves before actually taking it further. And that has to do really with you know, the whole conversation about how do we know and what do we need to know and what do we need to receive from the partner country. Sometimes the information that comes from a partner country is actually taken with less, let's say, scrutiny than when it comes from the individual member states. But it does not mean that that indeed there has not been a certain evolution in how Brussels thinks, and we now have this ongoing revision of the implementation rules for cyber diplomacy toolbox. So there might also be some new things coming up. What I think are some of the aspects that are still maybe critical and that the EU is struggling with when it comes to cyber, and I will not talk about in terms of operational, because I think operationally they have done a pretty good job in terms of setting up this clearinghouse almost from providing the assistance to Ukraine, which is not something that has happened before. But I think what the EU member states and many others, frankly, are also struggling with is how do we think about this framework of responsible state behavior in the context of a military conflict like Ukraine. Many things we see on the ground happening from both sides would be a violation of that framework. We sort of seem to focus on one side, you know. So I think there is a political dilemma on how to deal with it. The operations of proxies and non-state actors, you know, against the government in Moscow, but also in Belarus, for instance, is a bit problematic because these are proxies actually operating in relation, or you could establish this connection between them and the governments that provide certain tasking, and then, of course, trigger the whole response mechanism. But that is something, frankly, that I think the policymakers do not want to address openly in trying to figure out how to deal with those non-state actors that actually, you know, act on the side of a victim that we also support, and how do we actually think about the norms and rules that were developed in that context. I think is something that that we're having a bit problem with.
Thank you so much. I think we will end there. Very interesting talk, many interesting questions. Rather complicated issue. Both the EU is complex, cyber, many different interpretation of cyber and many different interpretation of what defense is. So this is a complicated picture, but it's very interesting. I hope you liked it as well, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.